Hi everyone, welcome to Double Canopy. Today we have Dr. Nina Bassuk. She is recognized as one of the world's leading authorities on urban plants, especially trees, and just this year retiring from her directorship at the Urban Horticulture Institute, which she founded in 1980. Dr. Nina Bassuk, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
You're in New York. It's 3 hours ahead. It's lunchtime.
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
Okay. I'm seeing a lot of green trees behind you, so it hasn't turned yet.
A few things are turning, but the ones I have in the back of my head there are still quite green.
When did they start turning? In
They
mid-October?
There's a few that are going now, just starting, but it'll be mid-October before they're in full flight, yeah.
I've only been to New York once, and it was in May, so everything was green and huge at that point. Yeah. What inspired you early on to study horticulture?
Well, I was thinking about this, and I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, a very urban place, and I always appreciated the trees and plants that I saw there. But I really became interested I had like a postage stamp garden or place, and I was trying to think of plants that I could grow there, and would go and find plants and try plants and grow seeds, and this really became a kind of passion for me to see what I could grow. I also got really interested in what I call kitchen horticulture, which is taking avocados or sweet potatoes, carrot tops, and growing them in water, which I used to do all the time. And I just became really interested in this area because I think it was very urban, and I appreciated the plants, and I also used to try things out. And it was really like a visceral love of seeing things growing. I really loved to see plants growing. I tried everything, seeds, and it wasn't because of a family influence. My parents were not horticulturally inclined. They appreciated it, but it was something I just started to do.
That's interesting. My brother was the naturalist in our family, and he remembers all the species names to this day. It's not a talent of mine at all. So I have a general interest in conservation and environmentalism, but he's the naturalist, and I can't really trace it to someone else in our family. He just picked it up on his own.
Yeah, it's interesting how, I started getting catalogs and growing seeds and putting lights in my house in a place where I could grow things under lights. And it was just a passion from quite a young age.
And your parents supported you?
Yeah, they were pleased that I was involved in this. But that was always an interest, but my career focus was music. I was a musician. I went to the public high school of music and art, and my first year of college was in conservatory music.
Oh, interesting.
Although plants were always a hobby, that's something I was really growing up, but music was always a profession until I went through my freshman year, and I decided I didn't want to practice 12 hours a day. and I was 17, and I didn't really know if that was the right career choice, so I took a year off, and then I said, really, what I want to do is work with plants. So I transferred to Cornell University as an undergrad, and I graduated 3 years later.
Okay.
Bachelor of Science.
So you're at Cornell, and you studied overseas too, right?
Right, I did my PhD in England.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, and who are some of your early mentors?
One of my earliest mentors was my advisor at Cornell, Harold Tukey, was my advisor, and I found him really great person to talk to. He would, I'd sit down in his office and we'd talk plants or whatever, and he was a big influence.
And was he or you focused at that time on urban horticulture?
No, it was just plants and propagation. Plant propagation was my first focus, and he was a propagator. And so that's where I first went. And there was no urban horticulture field in 1975 or whatever. Mm-hmm. I graduated in 74, so it was 72, 71. There was no field of that.
Okay, so you graduated, and it was 74, and then I think Urban Horticulture Institute you started in 1980.
1980. So I was 5.5 years in England doing my PhD.
Okay. What unaddressed problems did you see then, and how does the Urban Horticulture Institute attempt to resolve them? You saw a need for something like what you created. How did that arise?
Well, it's interesting because actually it was governmentally mandated that there be an urban horticulture program at Cornell. And I was hired. I had an urban background. I thought a lot about trees and cities, but my PhD was not on that. But when I got to the job, I think, well, what's the biggest influence I could have on people's environment and well-being? And instead of working in private gardens and so on, I decided to work with street trees, which is the most democratically public part of horticulture. I knew when I walked down a street with lots of big trees versus a hot, dry place with nothing, it made a difference. And so I decided to work with trees. And the Urban Horticulture Institute was basically founded to look at the physiological problems of trees in urban areas, figure out what the problems were, how can we address them in a general way.
Mm-hmm. So you said that there wasn't really any organized focus on urban horticulture prior to the 70s. But it makes me wonder about old cities like Paris or even older around Europe.
There are places where tree planting it didn't start in the 1980s. I mean, it was hundreds of years before that, and there were different historical influences to change the way cities looked. I mean, especially in Paris or in Italy, there were grand alleys of plants that were impressive, and still are in some places, which were in parts of the urban design movement at that time, not so much as a horticultural basis, but looking at urban design and grand boulevards and streets and so on.
So what was the first thing you guys started doing in 1980?
Well, I first took a look around. First 6 months was kind of going out and meeting people, talking to people, seeing what they thought of being as a problem, and I got all kinds of responses from that, but it helped me get a sense of where I saw the problems in the Urban Horticulture Institute and in the really downtown area. So I wasn't thinking of, big suburban tracts where there's lots of soil and plants grew fine. It was really the downtown areas. And it became apparent that plants were under assault from mostly heat and drought and compacted soil, and they were kind of shoehorned into these little boxes in the streets, and they didn't last very long. They didn't live very long.
Yeah, I saw one of the pictures you had of a very shallow root system. It looked like a pancake, basically.
Yeah.
Was that the majority of the trees that you would see?
Well, trees that are surrounded by pavement or asphalt or any kind of pavement, concrete, the soil beneath that pavement has to be compacted.
Right.
Meet engineering standards so that the pavement's not going to subside or to fail. And so being that's a requirement, then you carve out this box and put the tree ball in it. The tree roots cannot access that soil, so if they get out at all, they go very shallow into what's called a base course under the pavement, which is kind of gravel. And if they can get out, they're just very shallow, and that typically 4 inches would be a lot.
That's not enough. So would you see a lot of, I imagine trees just didn't live as long in a situation like that. They would fail and fall over.
I mean, sometimes tree roots can make a break and get into somebody's front yard or leftover green space or soil area, or they can get into a sewer, or they can make a break for it. In those cases, the trees can get pretty big. Where their roots are relegated to be in that very shallow area or just in that box that they were planted in, they live for very short times. I mean, there have been estimates anywhere from 15 years to maybe 30 years. But saying that they're alive doesn't mean that they're thriving, doesn't mean that they look great. That means that they're alive. I mean, there's parts of them and they're alive. So plants are not like animals. They live and die cell by cell. You can have part of them that's dead and part of them that's alive.
We had, I'm in Alameda, next to Oakland, and I think it was a year after we moved here, the famous downtown boulevard, Park Street. I don't know the issue inside and out, but they claimed that the tree roots were taking over the pipes and electrical wires that were running up and down the street, and these were gorgeous trees and sort of gave the street its identity. I mean, really, just this beautiful canopy over the sidewalks. And then they did it over the weekend, and it was
Right.
Friday to Monday. It was a completely different place.
Yeah.
I mean, that has to happen quite often.
Well, people don't necessarily see the trees until something terrible like that happens.
Yeah.
It's happened many times.
Yeah.
And they often do it on a weekend.
Yeah.
Or over vacation or holiday time.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, there's one thing about trees in the above ground infrastructure, wires, but below ground, it's also can happen. But we can actually plant trees so that they're not going to be growing into sewers or pipes and so on. It's just the way you know what the infrastructure is before you plant. Doesn't mean we don't plant where there's pipes, but you can. But also, the infrastructure is getting better. I mean, there's some old infrastructure which had lots of leaks. The roots would seek those out. Mm-hmm. But with the infrastructure getting better, it's less likely to happen. There are conflicts between the built landscape and trees that we try to avoid.
Yeah. So the above ground in the canopy, you see crews cut out holes in the canopy to make way for the wires. Does that really harm the tree, or do they sort of adapt and move on?
Well, it's a big hit when it depends how much is taken out. It's a big hit because the canopy is where plants make food, and when you have the food source taken away, other parts the root growth stops, the plants don't have as much defenses against disease and insects, and it can be done well. That kind of reduction pruning can be done well, or it can be done poorly, and that's a skillful arborist type of techniques. And how you cut, where you cut, is all important until if it works or not.
Mm-hmm. So you guys developed some practices at the UHI. Scoop and dump is one of them.
Yeah.
What is that?
Scoop and dump. Well, we realized that not only under pavement, but in areas that had development or construction or cars and trucks and trailers and machinery, during development, after those machines went away, the soil would be really compacted. And then very oftentimes someone would ask, well, can you now put a garden there? Can you develop a landscape? And so, the soil was like a brick. And we knew we had to do something. So in the late 90s, we started doing this technique called scoop and dump, basically where we would put compost, about 4 to 6 inches of compost, on the compacted surface. And then with a backhoe, we'd come and dig down like 18 inches and with the compost and the compacted soil, lift it up in the air and then dump it. So scoop and dump. And we'd get veins of compost through this cloddy, compacted soil.
How deep would you go?
18 inches.
18 inches.
Could be 15 to 24, but approximately 18 inches with a big bucket of a truck. Mm-hmm. And we'd scoop and then dump it, and we'd get these veins of compost through the cloddy soil. And we plant right in that, and then we mulch the surface. And we did this for many, many years, and we still do it. But I had a student who I asked let's look at what happened over 13 years of doing this. And we did a study looking at what happened to the soil. The plants were growing well, but we wanted to look at the soil predominantly. And we found that over time, the soil actually improved. We think that, well, if you scoop and dump it, it's probably best right away, and then maybe it doesn't get good influence goes away after a while. But we found the soil actually got better over time. And that was interesting to us. And basically we were encouraging microorganisms, we were increasing the organic matter, we were basically bringing life back into the soil. And
compost was the only amendment?
Compost was the only amendment. But a lot of it. It wasn't like a sprinkling, it was 6 inches of it. Mm-hmm. After we planted and mulched it, we would mulch it every year to increase the organic matter until we have what's called canopy closure, where the shrubs or tree leaves are touching each other. Mm-hmm. And then when they drop their leaves, that also increases organic matter. So many people have said that if you add so much organic matter, which is maybe a third by volume, initially, that will, subside, it'll be eaten, go away, and you'll have subsidence. Well, we never found that to be the case because we were increasing the organic matter every year until the landscapes could maintain the organic matter with leaf litter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a life cycle that happens with the microbes where they eat dead microbes after, that cycle is completed, and it sort of cycles through and builds up over time. I wonder, from a municipal perspective, is it tough to convince people in the public and in government that just letting the litter fall and stay there is that hard to convince people to?
It's an aesthetic. So I am not proposing to leave leaves on grass, on turf, because that does smother it and it's not healthy. But in landscape beds where you have not just tree pits, this is not meant for tree pits. This is meant for landscape beds in larger areas. There's no reason why the leaf litter cannot stay in there.
Mm-hmm.
People have asked me this. People have asked me, well, aren't you building up fungal diseases and bacteria? I said, well, that's perfectly fine, and we want the fungi and good bacteria to be there, and the microorganisms. They're doing the heavy lifting, in fact, in terms of making the soil aggregation and structure better.
Mm-hmm. So another thing you developed was CU structural soil. What does CU stand for?
Cornell University.
Oh, okay. And did you guys...
You're not supposed to say Cornell when you have a product, Okay. But CU is okay.
Okay, CU. And did you guys develop this concept, or was it built on somebody else's idea?
This is when in the mid-'90s we realized that we needed more soil volume to allow trees to grow to their envisioned design size, and we weren't able to get that in normal sidewalk situations. So CU soil was developed to be able to be laid under pavement and to meet engineering specifications for load bearing, yet still allow tree roots to access this, not like the pancakes roots that we see in normal street situations. It was influenced by the way that soil for golf courses is designed so that it's compaction resistant. But this is sand. When you're talking about golf courses, you're talking about sandy soils. But when we're talking about trees, we wanted larger roots, bigger volume, so we used a gravel and soil mixture that the gravel would be load-bearing, would have each piece of gravel touching each other, so it wouldn't be compressible. Mm-hmm. And in the large pores between the gravel, we would have soil that wouldn't be compacted, and roots could just penetrate through that. Mm-hmm. So that's a kind of a gravel soil mixture with CU soil, and we did a lot of work on figuring out what we needed to do, what size gravel, what type of soil, how to do it, how deep, we had to look at the results, and it took many years, and it's now out there. But it's only meant to be for under pavement, and some people get excited and say, I'm going to put it everywhere, because it's a compromise between the engineers who need that load bearing and the trees who need the soil. So it's not as it doesn't have as much moisture as we'd like if it was a normal soil. Mm-hmm. So what trees you choose are important.
And so scoop and dump is for situations where you can't do that. You can't change what's under the sidewalk. And then CU structural soil is for when you're actually laying a whole new pavement, sidewalk, city planning.
Right. I mean, sometimes it's retrofitted too. I mean, there's also, we've developed a way that you can create a breakout zone. Let's say if you have a sidewalk next to, a green space, could be a churchyard or house or whatever where there's green space, and you take out a couple of flags of the concrete and to create a safe passage for roots into somebody else's front yard. That's another way of doing it where you don't have to start from scratch. Mm-hmm. Breakout zones.
Okay. And you said you were testing this in the 90s?
Yeah.
Okay. And
it was patented by Cornell in 98.
Okay.
So.
When was the first real urban use of this?
Oh, we did it in Ithaca, New York, where I live and where Cornell is we used the downtown Ithaca as a lot of testing area. And so with a cooperation with a great city forester, we laid a big street of this with structural soil in 1997, and it's still there. It's actually all over Ithaca. No one knows it's there. You don't see it, but I know where it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I can test the trees, and I can measure how the trees are doing in the various installations. We also did it in research fields where we built sidewalks to nowhere, and we actually simulated urban streets in a research area where we could do other kinds of measurements.
Mm-hmm. So everyone has seen roots displacing sidewalk slabs. Do you see that often with structural soil?
Well, the reason why we talked about pancake roots at the surface, well, roots grow, but they also grow radially,
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, right? They grow radially.
Mm-hmm.
And as they do that, they push the sidewalk up. And that's because they're at the surface, at that 4 inches or so.
Mm-hmm.
And they do taper down further away they get from the original trunk, but it's those first 4 feet or so from the trunk that the major damage occurs. And we did some experiments in Ithaca, so far so good, where we planted trees in narrow tree lawns or green strips between the sidewalk and the curb, and we took that breakout zone of the sidewalk and we put structural soil down there. And what happens when roots hit structural soil, they grow to the full depth of the structural soil. So we put like 30 inches of structural soil, and the roots, when they hit that, they go down and then across into somebody's front yard. So they don't stay at the surface that you would expect with normal tree planting. And so we have some of these experiments up, and after 8 years, we haven't had any sidewalk heaving. What we also did, of course, as a scientist, you do the control where you plant the same trees without that, and we are seeing some sidewalk lifting. But it takes time to see this.
Sure.
That's the nature of tree work. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't happen overnight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you said you know where all those sites are in Ithaca. How often do you go survey them, and do you guys have a program to do long-term studies of this stuff?
Well, there's some that I do long-term studies. There's one parking lot where I have trees planted in structural soil with porous or non-porous asphalt on top, and I do study those, and I've written papers about those. And the way we look at roots, because cities don't like you to dig everything up when you plant it, we actually use ground-penetrating radar to look and see where the roots are and the number of roots and the depth and the density of roots. And so we've done that, which is a great tool to measure, to look at roots underground.
And you can do that through sidewalk slabs?
Yeah, you can do it through anything. Sure.
Okay.
There's programs that basically, ground penetrating radar has been used for many things,
Mm-hmm.
Archaeological and metal and all kinds of things. But there's a program that looks at roots, which is basically tubes of water,
Mm-hmm.
and we put it through that program, and we can look at where the roots are.
Great.
Yeah.
I understand that there's quite a few sites around the country using the CU structural soil. How many, number one, and number two, how did you get the word out?
Well, I mean, I feel very strongly about getting the word out. So my work is I do teaching, I do research, and I do extension, which is getting the word out. And so first of all, in terms of number, I think it's about 2,500 installations in every state and in the provinces of Canada, Puerto Rico. There are some installations in the UK, Israel. There are some different ones in Scandinavia where they use the same principle but bigger stones. So it's definitely out there. Getting the word out is I give lots of talks. I have a website where I have all kinds of user-friendly documents. I write the journal papers for refereed audience, but I also do translate that into practitioner types of bulletins and so on. So it's always there. It's free.
Mm-hmm.
And I give a lot of talks. I was just looking up how many talks I've given in the last several years, and it's somewhere around 550 talks. I mean, I think it's important. I mean, I have the website, and that's great, but and you can Google all this stuff and find my website, but people like to talk to you.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
They like to hear it, face to face instead of reading things, and they can ask questions, and it's a different way of teaching. So I think that giving talks, and I've given a lot of them, has been useful.
Yeah, that's what I like about podcasts. It's like half a lecture and half just, chat and talking. Yeah. It's a great way to learn. Is there a particular or a number of conferences that city planners and park managers, urban planning people go to? Is that where you're?
Yeah, there's definitely there's an international Society of Horticulture, which is international, and people go to that. But on a local state, every state has an urban forestry council. New York does. I mean, every state does, and they also put on annual conferences. Mm-hmm. And that's generally where the word gets out.
Okay, raises a question. I just wonder about even my city. How all the planning that goes on for every single project in the city. Right. Are they getting the best practices, the current up-to-date stuff?
Hopefully there would be people in the forestry area of your city that would be talking to the planners so that they can get, it's, urban planning, urban forestry, urban horticulture is a multidisciplinary. Mm-hmm. So it really is good to get all those people on around the table.
Mm-hmm. I noticed first of all, I watched a number of your talks and they're terrific. But on one of the talks I saw, neon tree tags.
Uh-huh.
And
they were just chartreuse colored.
Chartreuse. I'm trying to remember what it was the species of the tree on there.
Yeah, it was basically a U.S. Forest Service, USDA Forest Service program called iTree, mm-hmm. which you can put in the species where you are, depending on the region of the country. You can put in the species and the diameter, DBH, and you can get a value of the stormwater, pollution resistance, pollution amelioration, carbon sequestration. It basically gives you all these environmental, economic values for the tree of that size in your area. Mm-hmm. And so we made these tree tags, like cost of a tree or whatever. If you go into the shop, and we say this tree gives you, and we did it over 25 years, so much in terms of monetary value for these environmental and economic benefits as a consciousness raising thing. So I had my students do them, calculate do the calculations, and then we did the posters and we put them on maybe 50 or 60 trees. And it just makes people think in a different way that these trees are, yes, there's a cost to planting them and maintaining them, but there's much more benefit of what you get from them.
Absolutely.
And it goes beyond the environmental and economic. It goes in aesthetic. It goes to the mental issues, and those are not quantified. Right. But just like you said, when all those trees came down, it was like I have a different city.
Oh, everybody was so angry. Everybody was really upset.
Yeah, and they weren't thinking about the cooling. They were thinking about this just made my city different.
Right. Yeah.
So there's a lot of value, and it's useful when you're trying to talk to legislators or anybody who's got the purse strings in your city to say, well, these trees are providing value. Mm-hmm. Yes, you're spending $1, but you're getting $5 back in value, and that, perks their head up and say, okay, well, maybe we should throw a bit more money at these trees instead of just seeing them as a cost, mm-hmm. seeing the benefits.
So you said you only did 60 of these chartreuse tags?
Oh, every year. Oh,
every year, okay. And was it just in New York?
Well, it's just on Cornell campus.
Okay.
And we did some downtown Ithaca as well.
Okay.
But, yeah.
And what was the response? Did people like seeing those tags?
Well, I watched people would just get there and read them, and I didn't really, poll everybody. What do you think about these? But mm-hmm. I always saw people reading them, mm-hmm. and I thought, well, if one person, changes their mind about or gets, consciousness raised, that's good.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a great idea. I would love to see it. I don't think I've ever have seen it. And now with QR codes, you could just, scan something and get all that information or more.
Oh, right. And the iTree program enables you to, do it on existing trees. It also enables you to plant a tree and see what it's going to do over time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a neat program, and one that a lot of cities are playing around with.
Yeah, my city, I mean, like a lot of cities, has declared a climate emergency. And I wonder, looking at that information from the USDA Forest Service, was it just the Forest Service, or was it other?
Yeah, it's a USDA Forest Service, but it's small I, big TREE, which is the program.
Okay.
And there are many suites of ways that you can use that iTree data. And we did the iTree design data, which we were looking, that was a particular suite we were looking at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So you can get a lot of information, and also in terms of cooling, which is a big deal everywhere in urban areas. The urban heat island has been around for as long as there's been cities, but now it's exacerbated by climate change. So the amount of cooling you can get from big trees is really significant.
Mm-hmm. And did you guys contribute any science to those tools, like the iTree design tool?
No, that was not.
So it's just a government program, and
yeah, I mean, the USDA program, Forest Service, is more looking at the benefits of trees, and my way of dealing with urban trees is looking at how we can get the trees to grow.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So, I mean, they're assuming, yes, you have a tree, it's growing, it's this big, and you get these benefits, but I'm saying, well, how can we get them to be that big, to get the benefits? In which case, in many cases, they're not at the sizes we would like them to give the benefits provided.
Mm-hmm. So we already talked a little bit about how urban planners find and absorb your work. I take it you've done a ton of consulting on municipal projects.
Well, I do, for my extension role, I do work with individual cities and so on, but that's part of my role in extension of getting the word out. Mm-hmm. Occasionally I would consult for different states and so on, but if I'm in New York State, that's just what I do as part of my job.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, I work with a lot of landscape architects, are my big audience, planners, city foresters, arborists, nursery professionals. These are all the professions that I work with.
And do you find that they are pulling you in at the appropriate stage of planning, at the beginning?
Often it's a little bit late. Often things are going ahead, and they come in at this point and say, "Well, wait a minute, let's look at the soil here, or before we get the plants in the ground." And sometimes it's a little late, but so I've been teaching for 42 years, and so all those students who've gone through know what they should do. And all the people I talk to say, you've got to do things right at the beginning. That's really the key, is doing things right at the beginning, and then you have less problems later on. It's trying to play catch up when everything is on the ground and done the wrong way, and yeah, it'll live for a while, but it won't do what you want it to do. And to play catch up at that point, or to give it a ton of resources, it's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm. And do most of your students go into those fields, city planning, urban forestry?
Yeah, I mean, primarily the landscape architecture field, urban forestry, botanic gardens.
You've had a lot of students over the years.
Yes.
I wonder what their motivation to get into this field was when they were young.
People have a love of plants and just enjoy seeing them grow, and then they can be focused on doing good for people. It becomes a more heightened response, as opposed to, I like plants, I like to see them grow, I like to try different things, and now I can work in a way that's going to help a lot of people. That makes it better.
Mm-hmm. So this goes back to our previous talk. So what has been your experience interfacing with city planners and actually getting plans implemented? Someone like yourself is more like a consultant for projects that are already in motion.
Well, sometimes you get involved in the early stages, which is good, or sometimes you get called in before things are already underway, or they know they want to do this, but can we make it better? Mm-hmm. So there's been various different places where I come in.
Do you find that people are generally receptive to you?
I had to learn for the city engineers and the people in public works are often more difficult not to crack. I had to learn to speak their vocabulary. Mm-hmm. speak engineering. And I learned to do that, especially with structural soil, which was definitely an engineer aspect of that. And we worked with engineers at Cornell who taught me how to evaluate the effects of structural soil in engineering terms, not just in horticultural terms.
Load bearing and all of that.
Oh yeah, load bearing and
Is your load secure?
Factor density and California bearing ratio and all kinds of things that we use to measure the strength and load bearing. So it's not just saying it's load bearing; you have to prove it. It is. So I work with engineers to do that. That's what it took quite a few years to do that. Working with a graduate student, Jason Grabowski, who's now at Rutgers, but he was the primary graduate student who did this work. And I should say that. I mean, without graduate students, nothing gets done.
Right.
You need the students to do the work.
What is your SWAT team?
Oh, SWAT was an idea. It was just called the Student Weekend Arborist Team. Students who had taken my classes and knew the trees, they knew the ID. We would go into small communities which didn't have the resources to hire a consulting firm to do a tree inventory. And in the space of a weekend, we would do the entire tree inventory. I had maybe 16 students working in pairs, and we had handheld computers that we would take the data on. Basically took the data on trees and took the data on spaces, plantable spaces for these small communities, and we would finish it in a weekend, as I said, and we develop basically a forestry plan. We can see what the data was, what the species were, what was doing well, what needed work, what needed a lot of work, and then come up with ideas that they might suggest to what they could do to improve their urban forest. We did this for 60 communities.
Oh, wow.
But they were small. They were not like New York City, much bigger. But they were small communities that just didn't have the resources or to think about an urban forestry plan. And so we took the data and then we did the plan. At first, we just took the data and gave it to them on an Excel sheet, and they said, "What's this?"
Yeah,
so
sure.
we had to actually create a master plan for them, which they could take or leave, but at least give them a place to start thinking about.
And who was the point person on these projects in the community?
We would always work with somebody. It would have to be either tree commission or a Department of Public Works person. They would contact us primarily, and we would work with them. So there had to be a connection point, and then going to the governmental body in that town or village to present the data to them as well.
Like at a city council meeting?
Yeah.
And were you ever working with a local landscape design or?
Yeah, landscape design. Especially many landscape architects or landscape designers I've worked with, or they still call me or email me with questions. And
but on the SWAT team project? Oh,
the SWAT team, there might have been a landscape designer in that planning group, but maybe
I'm just thinking of how a city or a community can then take what you've given them and then...
It would typically be a city forester or a Department of Public Works person who would implement the changes. But first, the city planning board or whatever would have to allocate money to plant trees.
So the SWAT team was a volunteer effort.
Yeah. Actually, they did make a little money. We asked the communities to pay the students like $100 a day, and they were happy to do it.
Okay.
I mean, it's like jump change.
Yeah.
And they got a lot of value out of that, and then they could make the decision whether to put some money toward this effort.
Right. I like it. That's a good model. Do you know if anybody...
we wrote a paper about this, and so other people can use the model. But and there's a website linked to my website about it. But after 14 years of doing this, we sort of ran out of communities in the local area here.
Sure.
I mean, it's really hard to take people and then do overnight, and so we were trying to do places we can go within a sort of an hour or two radius of driving to when you're taking 16 people. We did do some further afield, but it was a much more intense effort.
Yeah, going farther distances. Well, running out of communities, that's a good problem.
Yeah, it's a good problem to have, yeah.
I think you mentioned it, and I looked it up, and this is a fascinating program in New York City, the Million Trees Initiative.
Yeah.
And were you or the Urban Horticulture Institute involved in that at all?
Well, there was initially there were meetings of all kinds of experts who came together to talk about the Million Trees effort. I remember just maybe 100 of us in a room talking about what they should be doing. And I remember
who implemented it? Who started it?
Well, it was an impetus of Mayor Bloomberg, who was at the time mayor of New York City, and his planning department.
And they got Bette Midler to come on board.
Oh yeah, yeah, Bette Midler to be. She was a great tree advocate.
Terrific.
Is a great tree advocate.
Mm-hmm.
So they basically said we need to plant 1 million trees. It's not just street trees; it's trees in highway areas and public housing. It's trees wherever they could get them.
Mm-hmm.
But a significant number were in street trees. And I made the big pitch. I said, you can plant all these great trees, but what about the soil? What about trying to improve the soil so that you can get the trees to grow to your envisioned design size? And that was, well, they said, well, they did widen or enlarge the tree planting pits. You saw the ones before were just like a 4x4. Mm-hmm. Now it's 5x10. It's something.
Yeah. Was there a bad reception to this idea of improving the soil?
There's a lot more money and a lot more involvement in terms of retrofitting an existing sidewalk was difficult.
Right.
Although there's quite a few structural soil projects in New York City where there's new construction.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, this scoop and dump with a couple cubic feet of top compost, that's not too expensive, is it?
Yeah, but if we're talking about street trees.
1 million trees, yeah.
Well, yeah, scoop and dump. I pitched that to Central Park in New York City. They were interested, but I never knew what came about that. Because it's not just street trees, and the worst situation was tree pits, but you could have parks that have been compacted and trees are struggling to get out, and where you have the ability to remediate real soil as opposed to going through the compromise of structural soil.
Right.
That's always the best thing to do. And I've started doing that in street situations where you have we call a tree lawn between the sidewalk and the curb. It's a narrow area. And I started doing that here in Ithaca, where some trees would get the scoop and dump process for maybe 10 feet on either side of the tree, and then you have the tree, and some wouldn't. And after 3 years, I've taken the data this year, and the ones that had the scoop and dump are significantly better. Mm-hmm. So that's the first instance of a scoop and dump in a typical city tree lawn situation. So I think it can be done as long as you have some area. Everything is not paved.
Right.
Everything is paved, you can't do that. But if you have some green area where the tree is planted, then I think scoop and dump is perfectly fine. Mm-hmm. And easier. Right.
Yeah. So was the Million Trees Initiative, was it a popular program?
Yeah, it was popular. They finished early. I think they gave themselves, I'm not sure how many years, maybe 8 years or 6 years to do it, but they finished early. And after they finished, I think 3 years later, they started to look and see what happened, in terms of the street trees at least. And it's unfortunate that at least 30% of the trees were not there. And that was fun. It wasn't like that they were dead, because they were gone.
They were gone. And, kidnapped.
Kidnapped or tree-napped. And I don't think they know what happened.
Really? So do you think...
I mean, some were dead. Some died, and then they were taken away.
Sure.
But some...
30% is a lot. That's a lot of trees. 30% of a million.
Yeah. Well, that was a street tree portion, which was not 1 million. Okay. It was all the other public housing and highways and so on, parks, that was part of that.
I wonder, do you think it was people in the community that just didn't like what was there?
There are those people.
Yeah.
If you're going to drop leaves on my front house,
Right.
There are people who don't like trees, so...
Really?
Yeah.
That's like people who don't like chocolate. There's got to be a similar ratio in the population. That's strange.
In Ithaca, for instance, when we started doing this door knocker thing where a tree is going to go in. We put a door knocker, said, you're about to get a new tree. Congratulations.
Yeah, Merry Christmas.
And, if you have any questions, call this number. And most people like trees.
Yeah.
But there's always a few who said, it's be messy. I don't like it.
Interesting.
You shade my vegetable garden. And then we also have signs on trees that have to be removed. And that also gets people going. Sometimes the trees are hazardous. They have to be removed.
Yeah.
Especially really big trees. I mean, when they are really big and they start to get hazardous, people get upset.
Yeah.
Because they see, trees like plants like animals. I mean, if there's a dead part of it, it's not dead. The rest of it is looking green. Why do you have to take it out? So,
right.
But it becomes a structural issue.
Yeah. I'm trying to think, what's the biggest tree in Central Park?
Oh, I don't know.
Tree species?
Oh, numbers. Species?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's lots of species.
Because I keep wondering if we can't plant like redwoods here in our city. What's the barrier to that might be a hazardous.
Where you are. I mean, you can plant. You're near Alameda.
Mm-hmm. Coastal redwood.
Yeah, I mean.
But if it fell over on a house or something, it would be catastrophic. Could be hazardous. I don't think
redwoods fall down too much.
No, I know, but 100 years from now.
I mean, right now, if you see in Florida with the hurricane, trees going over, and they go over with a flat plate of roots.
Mm-hmm.
Have you noticed that?
Yeah.
It's flat. So if we can get roots further and deeper, not to say that roots go down the mirror image of the top of the tree, but they could go to 3 feet.
Did you see that in the news?
If the tree's going over?
Yeah, today?
Yeah. Well, I've seen it for several days.
Oh, wow.
And the trees go over, and they have a flat root plate.
Wow.
Now, some trees like palms down in Florida, they're adapted to that kind of condition,
Mm-hmm.
and they sort of bend with the wind.
But
other trees, really old trees, I was looking at the some live oaks, which have been there for hundreds of years, going over.
So I don't know exactly how they did the Million Trees Initiative, but can you see that happening in other places?
It has been. Philadelphia has one. I think Los Angeles has one. There are several places that are doing some number. Chicago has one where they're trying to up the number of trees because it's a really benefit in terms of cooling the urban core, and especially in those cities, those areas that have been redlined in the past, which the legacy of redlining and reduction of infrastructure in those communities has made it hot.
You're right.
And not a lot of trees have been planted, so there's an acknowledgement that really more has to be done, and especially communities that are economically disadvantaged and didn't have the resources that were given to other communities.
And do you know if those projects are also spearheaded by a celebrity face?
Yeah.
Or if I'm just wondering how to do it, as a model, how to do this in more places, even in small cities. Not 1 million trees in a small city, but
No, maybe 10,000.
Sure.
Whatever. Yeah. I would think that celebrities would like to be involved with that, like to be seen as being part of environmental solutions.
Yeah.
Call them up.
Yeah, call them up. I don't have their numbers, but were you guys involved with the Highline project at all?
I was involved in one of the teams that was bidding for the Highline project.
Okay.
I was involved with landscape architects as a tree person to be on that committee. And that was a competition. And we didn't get them, and my team didn't get it. But I'm very familiar with the Highline, which is a really neat landscape, because it's a big window box. So you can't think of it as a natural landscape. It's you're familiar with it. It's a disused rail line above ground.
Right.
And they put soil in there and plant it, and it's great. It's very popular. I love it when I walk on it. But I also see everybody dragging hoses everywhere. It's not a natural landscape. It's a highly engineered, highly maintained window box.
Right.
And it's great. So it's great.
Yeah.
And there's a Friends of the Highline. These are volunteers who do much of this, so I don't think the city is paying too much into it.
Oh, okay. Okay, so that...
I'm not sure. I'm not sure who, but I know there's a Friends of the Highline.
Right.
Which are probably hauling the hoses around.
That's interesting. Yeah, because it's to have an elevated garden costs a lot more. It's structurally a completely different kind of project.
Oh yeah, I mean engineering, everything.
Yeah,
it's very neat to be up in the 2 stories up with plants, and it's a very neat experience, and it's very popular, and it's actually engendered a whole economic revival of that area because people come to the Highline, they want to get food or want to buy clothes or whatever downstairs.
Yeah.
And it really changed the whole economic outlook of that area.
Interesting. We have one in San Francisco. I'm trying to think of other places that have elevated gardens like that. I did see a picture. I haven't been on the Highline, but I did see a picture of these tree wells that had slatted planks all around them. The trunk was just coming out of these little circle in this slatted planks. I mean, it's just interesting. It's like you said, highly designed, highly engineered, kind of strange.
That kind of material is more valuable than the tree. The cost of the material is much more than the cost of the tree. So if the tree doesn't do well, they just take it out and put another one in.
So Nina, what is the best tree?
No such thing. No such thing. It's about the tree that does well in that particular site. So knowing the site, knowing the constraints or the opportunities of the site, knowing where you are, what the soil is, doing that site assessment is key to choosing the right tree. But there are some really great trees that are, I think the trees that can tolerate drought and flooding are some of the best trees because they can tolerate a wide range of environmental conditions, and some of the oaks can do that, particularly swamp white oak, which is a terrific tree, and that was the tree I was involved with the 9/11 memorial in New York City, where there was a designer from California who came and I just wasn't as familiar with the trees in the Northeast, and I suggested swamp white oak because it was a highly engineered site and they wanted big trees, and I suggested this, and they put them all. I said, don't just put one tree species, let's have a diversity. And no, they just put all swamp white oaks, and they're doing great. But that's we had a lot of history in that we've overplanted certain species, and then we get hit by a bug or disease that takes them all out, and that's not a sound way of planting.
And a diversity
you can have trees that look similar but are genetically diverse, and that is a way to hedge your bets.
Right.
So the oaks can do it. There's some other great trees and I have a woody plant database which people can search based on site conditions and find a whole bunch of woody plants that would do well.
You talk about porous asphalt, and I wonder, I've seen some demonstrations of different kinds of asphalt, and some where the water just looks like it's just going straight through it. It's kind of amazing.
It is. Yeah.
Where does the water go?
Well, you have to have a reservoir. You have to have some place for it to go. So if you put porous asphalt just on compacted soil, it wouldn't go anywhere. It would pond up and over. So when we put structural soil under porous asphalt, the infiltration rate is so high of structural soil as well as porous asphalt, it fills up like a whole reservoir, like a cistern almost under the ground, which is there. And then it goes below the structural soil into the whatever is there, the fill material. So you have to have a reservoir. You just can't put it onto regular old soil and expect it to go anywhere. But typically, where the trees are not involved, it's laid on gravel, which has big pores, and water goes through into the pores. But if you use structural soil, you have that as well as a substrate for growing trees. So the thing about structural soil, the limitation is that it doesn't have as much water holding capacity as other soils. So we have to get water into the pavement some way or other, and porous asphalt does a good job.
Okay. And how many people are using that around the country, the porous asphalt?
It's becoming more, but it's not more expensive, but it is more expensive because the asphalt companies have to clean out one of their regular asphalt bays, put in this new recipe for porous asphalt, and that unless there's a big project that is cost effective for them, then they charge more money. And so for small, there had to be a pretty large, big parking lot or big area that would be could bear the cost of that.
Well, how do you feel? You're officially retired now?
I'm retired. I'm emeritus, so I still have research going on. I mean, things don't stop the day I retired.
Sure.
So I have I have a whole bunch of hybrid oaks that I've been working with for 25 years and trying to get them out into the nursery trade. Oaks that would tolerate a lot of different conditions. I'm looking at improving structural soil with biochar, looking at see whether that gives us a bit more water holding capacity. So
the more microbes in there, the more water holding capacity.
Well, we have plenty of microbes. It's just the water we need. We have mycorrhizae in structural soil. It just comes. I mean, the roots have mycorrhizae on them. So but the problem is the water holding capacity. So if we could up the water holding capacity without losing the load bearing, that would be beneficial.
Do you have speaking dates on the books?
I have a few. I have a few. I'm trying not to travel quite as far. I travel locally. I mean, New Jersey or wherever. But people wanted me to go to Saskatchewan. I said, I'll Zoom you, but I'm not going to go there.
Zoom is great. Have you ever done a conference with Zoom?
Good point. I mean, I had to do a year of teaching on Zoom during the pandemic, and that was awful.
Yeah.
That was awful.
Yeah. And now we're doing podcasts on Zoom.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Nina Bassuk, thank you so much for talking with me today. This has been very interesting and helpful. I'm very interested in how your knowledge can bleed into city projects, municipal projects at the appropriate stage. Hopefully we can see more of it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to list your website and everything. Anything else you want to put on there?
No.
You're not on Twitter?
My whole life is in the website.
Great. Well, thank you.
Take care.
Yeah, take care. Bye. Have a good day. Bye.
You too.